We have lots to discuss here in today's video, including a bunch of updates from Elliotte Friedman on a Midsummer Unexpected podcast episode that he dropped on his 32 Thoughts pod here. So we're going to discuss some trade talk around the Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Big update on Matthew Tkachuk and his health, plus an update on some of the contract extensions that are being discussed between UFAs and RFAs, including Lane Hutson, Connor McDavid, and Kirill Kaprizov. Plus, we also have an interesting story as well that was shared on the 32 Thoughts podcast involving Nashville Predator defenseman Spencer Stastney. All that and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have lots to discuss here in today's video. A lot of updates came unexpectedly today on a surprise episode of the 32 Thoughts podcast from Elliotte Friedman and Kyle Bukauskas. A little bit of a midsummer update, if you will, with a bunch of things around the NHL. The episode actually included an interview as well with an NHL player, and that's Nashville Predator defenseman Spencer Stastney. I highly recommend you check it out. I'm not going to go into great detail, but essentially he kind of talks about some struggles of his that he's been dealing with when it comes to mental health, depression, etc. Really get into details how it's been something that's been festering for a long time, and obviously over the past couple of years it's kind of gotten worse and got to a point where he felt like he was completely checked out during the season and kind of couldn't wait for it to end, and came really, really close to retiring, even though he's still a fairly young player. Stastney and his family grew up in Wisconsin. His family ended up eventually kind of splitting up, where part of the family moved to Chicago. It wasn't really in the beginning. It wasn't due to a divorce or anything. That eventually did take place within his household, but originally they were looking for a more competitive hockey stream for himself. His siblings were all different types of activities and athletics, and obviously hockey was a big one in their household, and they decided that it was best for him and his brother and his mother moved to Chicago for more competitive hockey options, and his dad and his sister stayed back in Wisconsin. And basically a lot of what was going on, even though he was having a great time, things were not going well for his brother, things were not going well for his mom, and he basically kind of took on a lot of guilt that they were there for him, and that he kind of blamed himself for a lot of their struggles. His parents eventually got divorced, and obviously lots of other things that came from it as well. But it's kind of details, and other players speaking out openly about different struggles he's dealt with, and how he's gone about handling them, how he came close to retiring over it, and how he's doing his best now to kind of conquer things and trying to move forward here with a better path. So I highly recommend it. If you haven't checked out that episode, go listen to Spencer Stastney's story. Certainly was very interesting, and one that we didn't expect to hear about or even know what he was dealing with at all. So good on Elliotte and Kyle for kind of conducting that interview and helping him kind of spread awareness around what he's been going through. Now, as I mentioned as well, we got a lot of updates on that podcast as well, some of which were not real shocking, but obviously we know Elliott's been kind of trying to keep a pulse on everything. Lots of things have been kind of at a standstill here as of late. One item he did touch on was Matthew Tkachuk, of course, having a great summer, had his day with the Stanley Cup, got married, lots of family stuff going along, but we do know that he still has a big health recovery he's dealing with as well. After winning the Stanley Cup, of course, he revealed his extent of his injuries, and certainly not good at all. So Elliotte reveals on the podcast that he believes sometime soon, because we know, I honestly said before, I suspected we wouldn't get an update on Matthew Tkachuk until late in the summer, because with everything he had going on personally, if he was going to be having surgery or anything like that, they were probably going to be putting it off. But Elliotte says that he expects that at some point before the end of the summer, we're going to get an update indicating that Matthew Tkachuk is not going to be ready to start the upcoming 25-26 season, and that he's likely going to miss a big chunk of the beginning of the year as well. Suspects that he should be able to be back in time to participate with the 2026 Olympics, of course, which we know Team USA would be obviously very much wanting him to be there, and I'm sure he would want nothing more than to be there and would not want to miss that for anything. but obviously he's going to look after himself here as well. So Matthew Tkachuk, most likely, like we've heard before, with the kind of recovery he's looking at, wouldn't be shocking if it was like, a solid, 4 to 6 months, and that, maybe he comes back around, whether it be around Christmas time or into January, ahead of the Olympics. So that should be confirmed soon enough, which will also mean that the Florida Panthers are not really going to be forced to make a trade. There's been a lot of speculation that Evan Rodriguez would be the odd man out, being the prime contract that would be, short term and just enough money to kind of make them cap compliant, if you will. But I don't think that's going to be necessary. They'll be able to use some into LTIR here to kind of deal with the Tkachuk injury, buy themselves some time, and then we'll see where things are at by the time Matthew's able to return, and see if they need to make a move at that point. At the very least, it buys them time. So I don't expect to see a trade involving a cost-cutting measure, at least with the Panthers, before the season gets underway. Then, of course, they also talked a lot about some of the upcoming contract extensions for some pending UFAs and some RFAs as well, saying that he expects Connor McDavid and Kirill Kaprizov to both be the 2 highest paid players once their contract extensions are eventually finalized. Of course, we do expect McDavid's deal to probably in the next week here probably really start getting a little bit more serious conversations. Obviously, we know the McDavids were going to be busy here in early August with some events. So at this point, we don't really have reason to believe that either one of those extensions are going to have issues. But we have talked before about Kaprizov and wondering if there's any chance at all that they have a hard time coming to an agreement. We know that the Wild had made it pretty clear they were going to be putting big money on the table for him, and they had no problem making him to be the highest paid winger in the NHL. So, I guess we'll see. We don't have any updates to suggest that, they're going to have to change their minds or look towards a trade or anything of that nature. I think it's just a little bit less certainty with Kaprizov compared to McDavid that something's going to get done. But right now, the expectation is that they most likely both will, and end up being the 2 highest paid guys. Now, when it comes to some other names, he just talked about Lane Hutson and the Montreal Canadiens, talking about how the salary cap going up has kind of reset the market here in a lot of ways, which is kind of causing some of these players to maybe kind of take their time here, and negotiations are taking a little bit longer. Obviously, a guy like Lane Hutson is a player that the Montreal Canadiens obviously were quite pleased with last year, saw big progress, but obviously one thing they were probably hoping for during the season would be that they can get a big extension done with him and keep him around or under what Nick Suzuki was making, previously being the team's highest paid player. Now, since then, of course, they've traded for and extended Noah Dobson at a much higher number at $9.5 million. So obviously at this point, Elliott feels that Hudson's probably going to be looking for something in the Dobson range, because if you look at what Hudson's accomplished early in his career, he probably is going to feel like he's just as valuable and probably bring even more offense to the table than Dobson would. I guess the one thing that's different here, depending on the term or the contract, obviously Hutson would be still have some RFA years left, whereas this one was mostly all UFA years on the Dobson extension. So RFA years and UFA years are kind of valued differently and do impact the overall value of the contract in that sense. So it is possible that maybe they try to get Hutson a little bit less than Dobson, but depending on how long this takes, because in Hudson's case, he's not obligated to sign. They could go into the year and be like, you know what, at the end of the season, he's still restricted. Montreal is not really in danger of losing the player. Of course, there's always the offer sheet possibility. A player like Hutson, if he has the same kind of years he did last year or better, to consider an offer sheet, the team's going to have to come along and offer him a ridiculous amount of money, which is going to be big compensation. Probably unlikely you're going to see that, right? So Montreal would probably feel comfortable that they're not in danger of losing the guy. If he really wants to wait to do the contract, then they might not have a choice. The only thing is the longer they wait, the price is not going to go down. It's probably going to continue to go up unless he, for some reason, surprises us and regresses next year, which is certainly, I'm sure, not part of his plan. But at the end of the day, a Lane Hutson contract extension with Montreal is going to be very costly, and that Dobson contract and trade that they completed here will likely have a big impact on the overall situation with him. But clearly, like I said, for the longest time, they kind of had their cap ceiling, if you will, for players' contracts at what Nick Suzuki was making. And now with the market being different, the cap jumping them as much as it did, that's something that's going to end up being obviously, surpassed. Obviously, as they kind of redo some of these other contracts and as these guys come up, it's only natural that some of these guys' contracts are not going to be the highest paid anymore because they were done at a different time when the cap was cheaper, and obviously go from there. I know Patrick Laine is making a hefty amount as well, but that's not a contract that Montreal actually signed, even though they traded for and picked it up from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, as I mentioned, we also had some other talk around the NHL to talk about here today, including, we'll stick with what Elliot was talking about first, and we'll jump to another couple of other sources of information here. But I know they talked about the Maple Leafs a bit, with Nick Robertson coming to terms on avoiding arbitration. I know Elliot was still talking about the fact that there's still wondering around the league if he could still be traded before the season starts. Still question marks around his future. Elliot was talking about the possibility of Nick Robertson ending up with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Obviously, Kyle Dubas there knows Robertson well from his time in Toronto. And we know that they're certainly trying to get younger and add more talented young forwards and D-men there. So he kind of fits their age range and their timeline. Toronto needs to free up money to do other bigger moves. I know that the Leafs are reportedly still in on Jack Roslovic as one of the teams that are keeping an eye on him. And regardless if it's Roslovic or somebody else, the belief is they still would like to try to add a top six forward. And to do that, they're going to have to clear some money. So obviously Robertson's a name that comes up now that he's signed. Could be a name to watch. We know that Calle Jarnkrok and David Kampf are very much still out there in play, but they've been quiet around those guys as of late. Like Elliot did acknowledge the fact that, in some degrees, things are a little quieter right now, a lot of vacations and things around the NHL, but he, like many guys have said, he expects and thinks there's a good possibility later into the summer. It might be a little further into August than we thought before we see a bit of an activity pickup, but obviously, it's a prime vacation time right now. So, as we get into later in the month and teams are starting to, be a little bit more in prep mode for training camp and things, we're probably going to see more of a flurry of activity around that point. It's what it sounds like, at least I hope so, because it makes things more interesting to talk about, that's for sure. But between Jarnkrok and Kampf not getting much activity and now Robertson being signed, could he be, a trade candidate? It seems possible based on what Elliot was saying today. He also had said that somebody brought up to him where Yegor Chinakhov in Columbus wants to trade, and you could say that Chinakhov and Robertson, kind of have some comparable stuff to look at. Could there be maybe a swap of young forwards that maybe give each team a new player, get them a fresh start? And I don't think that Robertson absolutely wants to be dealt, but I know last year sure made it sound like, from what we heard, that Robertson preferred to be traded, ended up signing a 1-year deal, gets another 1-year deal, and as much as he's, I think, been an okay player for them, put up 15 goals, it just doesn't feel like the Leafs have a lot of long-term trust and confidence in the player. And, maybe a swap for Chinakhov might be something to look at. But Elliott seemed more convinced if he was moved, maybe a team like Pittsburgh might be a more likely landing spot. Kind of hard to say. Of course, there's still lots of talk around Nazem Kadri out there as well. I see lots of articles popping up, mostly through Montreal media, but there's some through other fan bases and other teams' writers as well. But Kadri, I know, was one of the players who didn't receive an invite to the Team Canada Olympic camp that's taking place in Calgary at the end of this month. Left an interesting comment, which was basically just a bunch of question marks on Instagram posts showing their roster. I think it was either TSN or Bar Down or one of those places that posted it. So he certainly seemed intrigued over the idea that he was not invited. A player that's, arguably as productive as some of the guys that were, and certainly lots of experience, has worked with Hockey Canada in the past at different levels, and a little bit surprising in a sense, but you can't invite everybody, and you can't have everybody on the team. I don't know what his chances were to be on the team anyways, but good player. But then again, team countries like Canada and the United States, etc., Sweden, they're kind of blessed to have many, many, many strong players, and you can probably put together two teams, really. But we know it's fair to say, based on that post, that Kadri might not have been, real thrilled with the idea that he wasn't going to get a chance. But as Elliot also confirmed in the podcast, just because players were not invited to that camp, it doesn't mean that they won't be considered for the team. If they have a really good start to the season and they catch the eye and attention of of the brass on the guys that are making the decisions. And he said there's definitely a possibility that other guys could be considered. So we'll see where that goes. But Kadri, we don't know that Calgary's. I really don't think they're actively looking to trade him. It just seems like there's a lot of fan bases keep linking him to their teams, and specifically Montreal and Toronto are the main ones. I know there's a photo that keeps being circulated, which I think is mostly through Habs fans and Habs like social media stuff, of Kadri as a kid wearing a Habs jersey. It looks like he might have grown up being a Habs fan. And there was reports earlier in the offseason when Kadri's name first kind of popped up there unexpectedly, that he would waive to go to Montreal, supposedly, for his no-move clause, but we can't confirm that. But yeah, there's still lots of chatter around the player. Again, I don't think we have any reason to think Calgary is pushing to trade him, but we do know that there are teams that really like what he brings and could use a player like him, which is why his name keeps popping up. And I think really that's all there is to it at this point. But certainly, like I said, fan bases like Montreal and Toronto would love to have him in their team. So we'll see. I can't confirm that it's going to go anywheres, but that seems to be the general consensus out there, is that I think it's mostly fan driven from all the Kadri stuff you see out there. Now, one thing that's not fan driven is the Pittsburgh Penguins, as we talked about with Nick Robertson maybe being a possibility there. The latest Athletic article for Josh Yohe says that he would be extremely surprised if the Penguins do roll into training camp, or the beginning of the season at least, and still have Rickard Rakell and Brian Rust both on the roster. So we talked about a good chance that both guys could be traded. There's lots of interest in each player. And, you have it right from one of the most connected writers in dealing with the Pens that, he'd be surprised if they're both still there. We've heard about a variety of teams for each player. Like with Rakell, I've heard some teams out west, like LA, for example. We've heard at one point Rakell was linked to both Toronto and Ottawa. I'm not sure that that's really an option there. Maybe Toronto, but again, Toronto would have to move some other money, right? So if they with Robertson maybe being linked to Pittsburgh now, maybe there's a deal there. That it could be a package around him. I'm not sure, but there's definitely lots of interest. I think the Rangers were a team that reportedly looked at Rakell. With Rust, we had heard, I think at some point the Oilers popped up. The Sabres were a team, a few others as well. There's no shortage of interest, and obviously the Penguins and Dubas are fully committed to this rebuild. They're fully committed to trying to get as young as possible for this coming season. And I honestly think they do want to tank and try to get the first overall pick for next year's draft and get their hands on Gavin McKenna. I really think that's their ultimate goal, more than winning hockey games for the coming year. So yeah, I'd be surprised too if both these guys are still with the Penguins when the season gets underway. But we will see what happens. Let me know your thoughts on all of today's news and rumors in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, of course, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.